The night my husband allowed me play together with his nephew become one of the most thrilling nights of my life. All of it came about a couple weeks in the past. The solar dipped low at the horizon, casting a smooth orange glow over the city skyline from our townhouse window. I watched the night maintain the hum of visitors underneath, mingling with the faint sounds of remote verbal exchange. It became the sort of calm that usually delivered me peace, but tonight it left a weight in its vicinity. Thomas, my husband, had left earlier that afternoon for a weekend work retreat. It wasn't the first time he'd gone away for enterprise. However, his departure today felt extraordinary. Perhaps it became the request he'd made as he kissed my cheek. "Goodbye, Margaret," he'd stated, lingering for a moment. "Keep an eye on Daniel while I am gone. He's nonetheless figuring matters out, and I don't need him to feel like a guest. Make him sense at domestic." Daniel, his nephew, simply 19, have been staying with us for more than 1 week, clean out of high faculty and making ready for university in the city. He'd arrived at our door with luggage slung over his shoulders and an endearing mix of shyness and gratitude. Thomas had insisted we take him in for a while to help him get settled. I hadn't minded. Daniel became polite, respectful, and had a positive, quiet charm that turned into easy to be around. Nevertheless, the house felt special with Thomas gone. The dynamic between Daniel and me had usually been cordial. However, tonight, as the sky deepened to twilight and the residence settled into its regular night stillness, I felt a diffused shift. Maybe it turned into the absence of his consistent presence, or possibly something I couldn't quite place my finger on. At 7, I heard the familiar creak of the steps. Daniel regarded inside the doorway to the dwelling room, his dark hair slightly tousled, wearing an easy hoodie and denims. He gave me a small smile as he stepped internal, the sort that made him look more youthful than he become. "What's up, Auntie Margaret?" he greeted, his voice gentle and warm. "Thomas advised me you would be here all weekend." "It truly is right," I stated, setting apart the e-book I hadn't absolutely been analyzing. "He didn't need you to sense abandoned." He laughed gently, sitting down at the couch across from me. "He concerns an excessive amount of." "I am exceptional." We lapsed right into a comfortable silence. I could not help, however, be aware of the manner he sprawled at the sofa, his long legs stretched out and his posture relaxed. There was an ease about him tonight that I hadn't visible earlier. "Than you hungry?" I asked after a moment. "Yeah, virtually," he admitted, sitting up barely. "What's for dinner?" I stood and motioned for him to follow me to the kitchen. "Let's determine that out." We settled on something simple: pasta with a short homemade sauce. Daniel volunteered to assist, and together we moved around the kitchen in a rhythm that felt particularly herbal. He chopped veggies with precision, his palms steady and positive. Even as I stirred the pot on the stove, the air between us changed into mild, full of the occasional funny story or anecdote. "You're no longer terrible at this," I said, glancing at him as he expertly diced a tomato. He grinned. "Neither are you. I notion you'd burn water." "Rude," I shot back. However, I could not help laughing. Whilst the food turned into a quip, we sat down on the dining desk. The soft glow of the overhead, mild, casting a heat ambiance over the room. Conversation got here without difficulty. His plans for college, his mind at the city, and some humorous stories approximately Thomas from his early life. He spoke with a quiet self-belief that drew me in, and I found myself hanging on his each word. After dinner, we migrated lower back to the dwelling room. Daniel took his normal spot at the couch, his frame stretching out readily, as although he owned the gap. I backed to the armchair, but my gaze kept drifting back to him. He had an ease approximately him this night, a confidence that felt new and interesting. "Thanks for dinner," he stated after some time, breaking the silence. It changed into pleasant. "You failed to ought to do all that." "It is no problem," I spoke back. "I loved it." There was some other pause, this one heavier. Daniel's eyes met mine, and for a second, it felt as even though the room had reduced in size round us. The air changed into thick, charged with something unstated but palpable. "I think I will head to mattress soon," he murmured, even though he made no pass to stand up. "Yeah," I said softly, though my coronary heart raced in my chest. He lingered a second longer, his gaze flickering over me in a manner that felt planned. Then, with a small smile, he stood and stretched. "Good night, Auntie Margaret." "Good night, Daniel." I watched him retreat up the stairs, the sound of his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the hallway. I sat there for a long term after the weight of the moment pressing down on me. Something had shifted this night, though I could not pretty placed phrases to it. All I knew was that I wasn't prepared to let the night give up just yet. The residence was quiet now, store for the faint ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of the wood flooring. As the nighttime settled in, I stayed inside the residing room for a while, watching the flickering mild of the fire. My mind circling, returned to Daniel. There were something in his demeanor tonight, and strength I could not pretty region, but couldn't ignore both. Eventually, I made my manner upstairs, my steps gentle at the carpeted stairs. The hallway turned into dim, lit handiest by means of the faint glow of the nightlight near the visitor room. Daniel's door changed into barely ajar, and that I hesitated as I passed it, the sound of his smooth respiratory achieving my ears. I shook my head, looking to clean my thoughts. This become ridiculous. I headed to my bedroom, shutting the door behind me, but whilst I changed into pajamas and climbed into bed, my thoughts stored drifting again to him. His easy smile, the manner his eyes lingered on mine, simply to conquer too long. I turned over observing the ceiling, my chest tight, with a peculiar mix of feelings I couldn't completely name. Sleep would not come. The stillness of the residence felt oppressive, the silence loud in my ears. I wasn't sure what forced me. However, after what felt like hours, I found myself slipping out of bed. My bare toes had been silent against the ground as I moved down the hallway, my steps guided by means of some unspoken pull. Daniel's door became nevertheless ajar, the faint light from his bedside lamp casting a tender glow into the hallway. I stood there for a moment, my coronary heart pounding in my chest. Daniel I referred to as softly, slightly above a whisper. There has been a rustle of motion from inner, and then his voice low and heat. "Yeah." I pushed the door open, lightly stepping inside. He became sitting up in mattress, the blankets pooled round his waist, his dark hair become mused, his eyes heavy-lidded with sleep. However alert, couldn't sleep. I admitted status awkwardly via the door. He smiled faintly, his head tilting barely. "Me neither." For a moment, we simply looked at each different, the weight of the silence filling the space between us. Then, nearly hesitantly, Daniel patted the empty space on the mattress beside him. "Do you want to sit down?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. I hesitated, each rational part of me screaming that this became a bad idea, but there has been something in his gaze, an openness, a quiet vulnerability that drew me in. I crossed the room and perched on the threshold of the mattress, careful to preserve a first-rate distance. "Is something for your mind?" he asked, his tone gentle however curious. I hesitated, unsure how to solution. "I don't know," I stated, sooner or later simply stressed. I bet he nodded, his gaze steady on mine. Me too. The air among us felt heavy once more, thick, with unstated words and unacknowledged feelings. I glanced at him out of the nook of my eye, taking within the sharp angles of his jaw, the curve of his lips. He looked one of a kind within the gentle light, softer, extra prone. "I am satisfied you're right here," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. I grew to become to him, my forehead furrowing barely. "What do you imply?" He shrugged, his eyes losing to his palms. "I do not know, it's simply exceptional to have a person around, a person who receives it, I guess." Gets what I requested, my voice barely above a whisper. He appeared up at me then, his gaze piercing and uncooked, what it's wont to sense by myself, like no one truly sees you. The honesty in his words hit me like a punch to the intestine. I swallowed tough, my throat tight. I see you, I stated softly, the phrases slipping out earlier than I may want to prevent them. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, neither folks moved. Then slowly he reached out his hands, brushing towards mine, the touch become electric-powered, sending a shiver down my backbone. My breath hitched, and that I looked at him, searching his face for a few signal of what he became thinking. Daniel, I began, my voice trembling barely, but he shook his head, cutting me off. It is okay, he stated, his voice slightly above a whisper. Justin, want this, even supposing it's only for a second. I did not realize what to say, my mind a whirlwind of mind and feelings, but as his arms laced with mine, his contact warm and regular, I discovered myself leaning into him, the gap between us, dissolving. His different hand got here up to reduce my face, his contact mild but firm. I closed my eyes, the arena falling away as I surrendered to the moment. To him, our lips met, tentative, before everything a tender brush of skin towards skin. However, then, the kiss deepened the warmth between us, constructing with every passing. Twined his fingers moved to my waist, pulling me nearer, and I permit him my own palms, finding their manner to his shoulders. It turned into incorrect. I knew that. But in that second it felt just like the maximum herbal issue within the international. His lips had been warm against mine, tender but insistent. I felt the load of him, the closeness, the simple pull that have been simmering under the floor all night time. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud and frantic. Inside the quiet of the room, Daniel, I whispered towards his mouth, unsure of what I was trying to say. Become I asking him to prevent, to hold? Even I failed to understand. However, he failed to shrink back. As an alternative, he deepened the kiss, his arms gripping my waist with a firmness that sent a shiver racing down my backbone. I discovered myself leaning into him, my frame responding in ways that felt each overseas and achingly familiar. He broke the kiss, his brow resting in opposition to mine, as we both attempted to capture our breath. His eyes searched mine, dark and severe, as if seeking to gauge what I was questioning. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his voice slightly above a whisper. I nodded, although my mind became spinning. "Yeah," I controlled to say, even though the word felt small and inadequate. He smiled faintly, his thumb brushing gently towards my cheek. "Top," he said, his voice tinged with comfort. For a second we simply sat there, the silence between us thick, however now not uncomfortable. I ought to sense his heartbeat against mine, the regular rhythm grounding me in a way I hadn't anticipated. But because the initial haze of the kiss started to fade, fact began to creep again, in the weight of what we have been doing, of who we had been to every other, loomed massive in my thoughts. This is crazy," I said. Finally, my voice trembling barely. Daniel chuckled softly, his breath heat in opposition to my skin. "Yeah," he agreed, his tone mild but severe. "But it would not feel wrong, does it?" I hesitated, the question striking within the air among us. Did it sense wrong? My rational mind screamed that it did that. This become a line we ought to never have crossed. However, my heart, my traitorous, aching heart, informed a one-of-a-kind story. "No," I admitted, the phrase slipping out earlier than I ought to stop it. "It would not." His smile widened slightly, a flicker of something like desire in his eyes. "Then perhaps it's now not," he stated softly, his hand nonetheless cradling my face. I desired to accept as true with him. I wanted to consider that this moment, this connection, becomes something natural and right. However, the worry, the doubt lingered at the edges of my mind, threatening to pull me returned to reality. What if I began, however, the phrases stuck in my throat. What if this changes the entirety? Daniel shook his head, his gaze consistent and unwavering. It does not need to, he said firmly. We can take it one step at a time. No strain, no expectations, simply this. He leaned in again, his lips brushing softly against mine, and I felt myself relax, the anxiety in my chest easing barely. His hands moved to my back, pulling me nearer, and I permit him my own palms tangling in his hair. The kiss deepened the warmth between us, constructing all over again. His touch turned into cautious but insistent, his movements deliberate and unhurried. It was as if he turned into taking his time, savoring every second, every sensation. I misplaced myself in him, in the warm temperature of his body, in the manner he made me feel. Seen, understood, wanted. It was intoxicating, overwhelming, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to, without a doubt, experience. As the nighttime stretched on, the limits between us blurred further, the relationship among us growing stronger. With every passing moment, the world out of doors diminished away, leaving simplest the two people misplaced within the quiet intimacy of the night. While we finally pulled away, our breathing heavy and our bodies pressed near, I checked out him, my heart full and heavy. That is going to complicate matters, is not it? I stated softly, a faint smile tugging at my lips. No matter the load of my phrases, Daniel grinned, his eyes sparkling with mischief and affection. Likely, he admitted, however, I suppose it is really worth it. I nodded, my chest tight with a mixture of emotions I couldn't fully name. Yeah, I said quietly, me too. Daniel rested his head on my shoulder, his breath heat in opposition to my neck. The room was silent besides for the soft hum of the nighttime outside, the occasional creak of the residence settling. I wrapped an arm round him, pulling him nearer, and he sighed contentedly. We stayed like that for some time, the quiet among us full of unstated mind. I could experience the rhythm of his breathing, consistent and calming, and it gave me a second to collect myself. My thoughts raced, replaying the entirety that had simply happened. Every contact, every glance, every whispered phrase. I do not need this to be a one-time aspect, Daniel said all at once, his voice breaking the silence. It became quiet but firm, laced with a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I hesitated, my hands tracing absent patterns on his returned. Neither do I admitted softly, but I do not know how we make this work. Daniel lifted his head to observe me, his eyes filled with a determination that caught me off defend. We will figure it out, he stated. We do not have to have all the answers right now. We just take it in the future at a time. His words have been reassuring, however, the weight of the state of affairs nonetheless lingered. The fact of what we would completed, of what we had been now, to every different become lots to process. But on the equal time, the notion of letting this cross, of letting him pass, was insufferable. Okay, I stated in the end, my voice barely above a whisper. Someday at a time, he smiled, leaning in to press a tender kiss to my brow. This is all we want, he stated, his phrases, a quiet promise. We stayed like that for some time, longer, wrapped up in each other, the relaxation of the world forgotten. It felt secure, comforting, like we might discovered something we did not even know we were looking for. Finally, the night began to trap up with us. The load of exhaustion settling in, Daniel shifted, pulling away slightly to examine me. We must probably get some sleep, he said, his voice tinged with reluctance. I nodded, even though I did not need to let go of him just yet. Yeah, I agreed, my very own reluctance clear in my tone. But then he turned to examine me, his expression open and uncooked. I don't need to leave, he admitted, his voice trembling with vulnerability. I don't need this to stop. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening at his words. Then do not, I stated, my voice steadier than I felt. Live. His eyes searched mine for a moment earlier, then he leaned in his hand, finding mine and holding it tightly. Are you positive? He requested, his voice barely audible, as if he turned into terrified of breaking the fragile connection among us. I'm certain, I stated, and I meant it without every other phrase. He closed the gap among us, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that became soft and tentative, however laced with simple hunger. I spoke back instinctively, my hands finding their way to his face, pulling him closer. The arena out of doors dwindled away as we lost ourselves in each different, the firefight casting flickering shadows throughout the room. Each touch, each kiss felt like a revelation, a deepening of the bond that had always been there, but had most effective now come to mild. It surely went from bad to worse, and I did now not understand what a younger guy become capable of. Wow, his touches have been so exceptional, and every time I thought it changed into the closing time, he became equipped for some other round. Sooner or later, I assume we finished after 5 or 6 times. When we had been finished, Daniel's fingers slid up my hands, his contact sending shivers down my spine. I have desired this for goodbye, he murmured towards my lips, his voice thick with emotion. I simply failed to recognize if you felt the equal. I didn't recognize it either. I admitted, my forehead resting against his, but now that I do, I don't want to stop. He smiled softly, his thumb brushing towards my cheek. Then we might not. The hours stretched on as we explored this new territory collectively, each second more severe and intimate than the remaining. There has been no hesitation, no worry, only a shared understanding that this became in which we were intended to be. By the time the fire had burned down to embers, we had been wrapped in every other's hands, our breathing sluggish and regular. Daniel's head rested against my chest, and that I ran my fingers through his hair, marveling at how right it all felt. This changes the whole thing, he said quietly, his voice slightly above a whisper. I nodded, urgent, a kiss to his brow. It does, I agreed. However, it's a trait I am ready for. We'll parent this out together, one step at a time. Daniel smiled, his eyes assembly mine with a warm temperature that made my coronary heart pain. I agree with you, he said virtually, and I trust you. I answered, my voice full of conviction. Because the night stretched on, we stayed there at the sofa, wrapped in each difference warmth, unwilling to let the moment quit. Something challenges lay in advance. We knew we would face them together, bound through a love that had in the end been let out. The subsequent morning I woke to the faint sound of birds outdoor the window and the tender creak of footsteps within the hallway. For a moment I wasn't certain if the occasions of the preceding night had been actual or some vibrant dream. However, the lingering warm temperature in my chest told me it become actual. Each look, each whispered phrase, every shared contact. I took a deep breath and got away from bed, pulling on a sweater as I made my manner to the kitchen. Daniel was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in his fingers. His hair became barely messy, and he wore an oversized hoodie that made him look more youthful, more vulnerable. He looked up as I entered, his face breaking right into a shy smile. Morning, he said, his voice smooth however warm. Morning. My voice nonetheless groggy with sleep. I moved to pour myself a cup of espresso. The silence among us, cozy however charged the weight of what we would shared, hung inside the air, unspoken however ever prescient. Daniel leaned against the counter, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. Are you, Key? He requested, his voice laced with problem. I nodded, meeting his gaze. Yeah, I said, I am Kay. Are you? He hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yeah, he stated, though there was a moderate tremor in his voice. It is just I cannot forestall thinking about final night. I set my espresso down and stepped toward him, setting a hand on his arm. Me neither, I admitted, but it's plenty to procedure. We need to take this slow, figure out what this means for us. Daniel nodded, his expression softening. I don't want to hurry something, he said. Justin, don't want to lose this. Lose you. You might not, I said, firmly squeezing his arm. We'll determine it out together." He smiled, the anxiety in his shoulders easing slightly. "Thanks," he stated softly. We spent the rest of the morning in quiet companionship, sharing small smiles and touches. As we went approximately our day, there has been an unspoken understanding among us, a mutual settlement to take things one step at a time. Because the day wore on, I found myself watching Daniel more carefully, noticing the manner he moved, the manner he smiled, the manner his eyes lit up. Whilst he laughed, it was like seeing him in a brand new light, and it filled me with a warm temperature I hadn't felt in years. By the time night rolled round, we located ourselves on the sofa once more, the gentle glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows at the walls. Daniel sat close to me, his shoulder brushing against mine, and I felt a quiet contentment settle over me. "Do you suspect this is crazy?" he requested all of a sudden, his voice slightly above a whisper. I turned to observe him, amazed by using the vulnerability in his tone. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze constant on the fire. "Us this? It's not exactly regular." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "Perhaps it is no longer ordinary," I stated. "However, it feels proper, and that's what topics." He turned to observe me, his eyes full of a mixture of wish and uncertainty. "You honestly suppose so?" "I do," I said, my voice company. "So long as we're honest with every different, as long as we're cautious, we can determine this out together." Daniel's smile becomes small but genuine, and he squeezed my hand tightly. "Thank you," he said, "for not jogging away, for giving this a risk." I could not run away even though I wanted to, I said, a teasing smile tugging at my lips. "You are a form of tough to get away." He laughed, the sound mild and actual, and it stuffed me with a quiet joy in that moment. I knew that something demanding situations lay in advance. We would face them collectively. Because the night wore on, we stayed like that, facet by way of facet. The warm temperature of the fireplace and the consolation of every difference presence wrapping round us like a blanket. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't clean, but it was ours, and that I think that changed into sufficient. I am not sure if it's Miles K what I did, and I have never informed Thomas something yet. Must I tell him? I do not know. I just don't know.